Well, welcome. I'm Portia Roberts. I'm the Policy Director for the National Center for Energy Analytics. NCEA is a new policy think tank dedicated to data-driven analyses of policies, plans, and technologies surrounding the supply and use of energy essential for human flourishing. Thank you for joining us here today for a critique of the IEA's 2025 Critical Minerals Outlook. This is the second event in our Energy Delusions series. Some of you may remember or were present for our first Delusions event early this year. At that time, we challenged the IEA's peak global oil scenarios. Scenarios the agency has since revisited to reflect the reality of possible growth. Today, we're here to talk about minerals. Headlines from only a week or so ago were a reminder, not a surprise. Beijing tightened the spigot on mineral exports. Washington warned of retaliation. That 1-2 punch should end any illusion that critical minerals are a niche matter. Minerals are the scaffolding of modern society. A huge array of minerals, including copper, nickel, lithium, cobalt, rare earths, and graphite, are foundational to everything from defense systems to computing, and from grid hardware to EVs, and indeed, even in the great race for dominance in AI. As you'll hear from our experts, who produced our new analysis of the IEA's Global Critical Minerals Outlook 2025, we have cause for concern. Neither America nor our allies extract and refine enough of the needed minerals. We have supply chains that run through narrow choke points we don't control. The broad outline of a solution for the United States is not mysterious. The challenge is execution and action. And that is what we're here today to discuss. I want to thank the co-authors of the report for their tireless work, Peter Bryant, Chairman of Clario and member of the NCEA Advisory Board, and his colleague Satish Rao, Managing Director of Clario. We also very much appreciate Brandon Craig, President of BHP Americas, joining us to talk about mining realities from the front lines. And of course, we're enormously grateful to have join us to kick off this event, Senator Mike Lee from the great state of Utah, where there has been a lot of mining for a long time. Without further ado, please join me in a warm welcome for Senator Lee, who joins Peter Bryant to discuss the state and future of mining and America's challenges and opportunities.
Great. Thanks, Portia. Nice, lovely welcome. Senator Lee, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for spending the time with us.
It's good to be with you.
Yeah. Let's jump straight into it. So obviously, everything's about reshoring everything to America. And we know just because of the processes, the time it takes to develop mines, processing facilities, even with the best outcome, we could be at best 10, 15 years away from having something de-risking our supply chain internally. So in the meantime, what should we be doing with those countries that do have the resources today? People often call that friendshoring. Some are allies, some aren't. What do we need to be doing in the meantime to help de-risk the supply chain with these other countries?
Obviously, we've got to reach out to our friends and develop these relationships in the short term. The short to medium term is going to require us to rely a lot on them. We've got other countries that are friendly to us that have operating capacity, the ability to mine, to refine, and to process and produce. That is an absolute essential for the near to intermediate term future. Because we can't, Rome wasn't built in a day, nope. and we can't remodel the elaborate structure that's been put in place through the Code of Federal Regulation, Code of Federal Regulations in the Byzantine labyrinth of regs that's constantly changing. All that is going to take time, to say nothing of what it takes to develop new mines, develop new processing capacity at home and within our allied nations. And then all this has to be sort of a two-step process where we do that for the near and intermediate term future. For the long-term future, we've got to develop that capacity. But in the meantime, develop that capacity to the greatest extent possible at home and in various allied nations. But before then, we need to look to existing production capacity wherever it can be found. And without both steps, we're not going to get anywhere. One of the reasons why this is so important is because China today has a chokehold grip on this marketplace. We look at other cartels that operate in the world economy. The most familiar one, outside the context of an overtly criminal purpose cartel, like Sinaloa drug cartel or one of its counterparts in Colombia, but for licit products producing legitimate non-contraband items like petroleum, China is something that makes OPEC look like a Sunday picnic by comparison. When you look at recent reports indicating that they've got a lock on 60% of production and processing and 75% of manufacturing across critical minerals. That's really, really significant. So just the sheer market share and dominance that they have there, to the point that if they were a commercial operator operating in the United States, they would be well into the territory of criminal scale cartel behavior. But not only that, but it's all under one roof. At least with OPEC, you're talking about multiple sovereign countries that are part of it, and it's not concentrated like it is. With China, you've got a huge, heavily populated country. It's its own cartel. It doesn't have to rely on other sovereigns to maintain it. And then you've got a high degree of concentrated political and economic power within their system of government. That makes this a real significant threat to us, and part of why I can't emphasize enough the importance of this two-step strategy that I'm describing.
I'm glad you brought up China, because let's kind of scratch on that one a little bit more. I think China has, because I personally don't like the term critical minerals, because it kind of hides the characteristics of each mineral being different. And China has a very actually complex playbook where they have a choke point on each mineral in a different way. And very quickly in nickel, they invested $25 billion in Indonesia to control the nickel industry, flooded the market with oversupply, crashed the price, and eventually the whole Australian nickel industry shut down, including BHP mothballed its nickel operations. 3 companies went bankrupt. And then with lithium, they just flood the market, drop the price, and then people like Albemarle mothball projects. And because they do that, the Western company projects are all unprofitable. They can't make the return on investment. So with that market reality, with their control over supply, they crash the price, things become unprofitable for the West. How do we operate in that market reality where Western companies just can't make projects work financially with this as a backdrop? Because that's a very powerful cartel, as you said, being under a single roof.
Yeah, no, it's very, very difficult. And here again, that's another example of where you'd be in big trouble in the United States with our competition laws if you did anything like that. If you deliberately flooded the market with a product that is below not only market rates, but in many cases below production costs, below any way you could break out the cost, to the point that you make it impossible for anybody else to be profitable in there because you're heavily subsidizing it through something else. That would be a crime if you did that domestically. If they were just a market participant, they would face criminal sanctions for that in the United States. So how do we deal with it? Well, again, this gets back to the point of this two-step process in which we have to develop a strategy with our allied nations to deal with production, refining, things like that in the near term, and while simultaneously pursuing the long-term reforms. And those long-term reforms have to involve a couple of things. At a minimum, we need aggressive permitting and regulatory reform. That's why I've long been an advocate for reforms like the REINS Act that would require that any new major rules, federal rules imposing binding obligations on the American public that are economically significant, typically defined as $100 million or more in economic and in compliance costs, in economic impact, would require the assent, the approval of Congress, both houses of Congress, and be submitted to the President for signature, veto, or acquiescence before they can take effect. We've also got to have permitting reform, wherein we take hold of not just NEPA, but NEPA and other permitting related statutes to move the process along further, to have shot clocks in place, so that it's not an open-ended process. Nearly 30 years ago, as a recently graduated a young lawyer, I was asked at a firm to do some research on NEPA on foreign countries that had adopted their own NEPA statutes. And one of the things that I was interested to discover was that a lot of other countries do have a much tighter clock around their NEPA equivalents. And yet those same countries that have adopted these laws have very clean environmental records. They have not suffered a deterioration in the environmental quality that's the product at the end. Our system is in no way inferior to theirs in terms of the environmental protections that go along with it, and yet they get it done. So we've got to have that stuff. We're working on that in Congress. We've got a bipartisan effort of which I'm a part. As the chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, I'm a member of a very small working group of Democrats and Republicans trying to bring about that reform. I'm also pushing within that. Hopefully we can get it within that package, if not through parallel legislation, that would accelerate the other end of the necessary component of permitting reform, which is the post-record of decision judicial review. Very often, it's the judicial review of the final agency action that itself can consume the most amount of time and resources. That's what can drag it on for what should be a decision involving a year or two. It's what can easily draw it out into a decade-long or multi-decade-long endeavor. We've got to have both of those, and I think the judicial review component of it ideally should involve a few things, including a tightening of the standing requirements. I think we've gotten loose with what we allow in terms of people who don't have true Article 3 standing. The constitutional minimum for standing has sort of been, it's like the courts have looked the other way in allowing people to assert standing who don't actually have it under Article 3. And I think we also need to tighten up the way in which we compensate lawyers under the Equal Access to Justice Act. And there ought to be, ideally, some type of statute of repose or a jurisdictional shot clock on the court's jurisdiction. There are ways of doing that. We're not very accustomed to doing it, but if you limited, say, district court action on a particular record of decision to no more than 12 months, and action before an appellate court in the federal system to no more than 12 months, you don't have to worry as much about a jurisdictional shot clock on the Supreme Court because most cases don't have cert granted. A lot of them don't even seek it, but most of them don't get, your odds are around 1% or so of getting a cert petition granted. But even if you do get cert granted, the Supreme Court tends to hear everything and resolve it within one term.
Yeah.
So anyway, that would help.
I think it's important. And just one more question on permitting reform. Obviously, permitting reform is not just needed for mining. It's needed for all our energy infrastructure. And if we're to double our electricity generation, we need to reform permitting for power lines, etc. And I know in the last term there was a bipartisan piece of legislation for reform that it wasn't able to be passed. I mean, how high a priority is it now, do you think, to pass something? Because everything that's reshoring and economic expansion is almost dependent on this if we're to do it in a timely manner.
In the realm of things that are reasonably achievable, not easy, but that could be achieved in this Congress, I can think of nothing more important than that effort. And the Manchin-Barrasso proposal sort of serves as the foundational building block of what we're working on right now. Now, there will be changes to it, in part because some of those things have been rendered obsolete or the ground has shifted since then. Some of the provisions that were inserted into the One Big Beautiful Bill Act augmented that, so that there will need to be a few adjustments made to reflect the changed circumstances since then. But yeah, there's nothing more important than that. It's important to remember also that, even in the current environment where it takes way too long, we still do have success stories where things are operating. Now, the White Mesa mill in southeastern Utah is a shining example of that capability, where even against great odds, we've got some of this. This is the only currently licensed and currently operating conventional uranium mill operating in the United States. But it's got great capacity to produce both light and heavy rare earth minerals, and that's a great thing. And we've got things like the Kennecott copper mine owned by, owned and operated very effectively with a great high degree of environmental and public safety in mind. The Rio Tinto Kennecott copper mine in Utah, and they do a lot there.
Yeah, no, it's good. As they say, where there's a will, there is a way. So we can get it done. Just kind of shifting gears a little bit and getting into kind of federal lands. I mean, obviously, a vast amount of acreage is in the hands of the federal government. What role do you think that plays in terms of opening up access? We have good geological information for minerals development.
Particularly in the western United States, this is a big issue, and federal lands are a very prominent part of that. In many western states, like mine, the federal government is by far the largest landowner, though that vastly understates the enormity of the role the federal government plays in my state, because in my state, it's 2/3 of the land. It's about 67% that is owned by the U.S. government. So that being the biggest landowner, the owner of the overwhelming supermajority of the land, and the largest blocks of contiguous land owned by one entity, it's federal. And so, yeah, it plays a huge role, and we got to make sure that we're not putting too many federal specifics, federal land use obligations on that are unnecessary and that are not meaningfully moving the ball forward in terms of environmental quality relative to other nations. Now, as we do this, it's important to keep in mind our environmental record really is second to none in the world stage. There is not another country in the world that has a better environmental record than we do. Of the countries that are capable of doing this stuff, it's one thing for a tiny, tiny nation without a lot of mineral development to have extremely onerous environmental regs, but it becomes academic if they don't have the ability to produce this stuff. But especially compared to China, which is huge and has a lock on it, our environmental record, it is night and day. It is heaven and hell comparison, and so we got to make it easier rather than harder.
Yeah. So one last question, and the clock's almost run down. Went quick. We're just scratching on some key topics. Obviously, there's I think last count is around 17 federal agencies have their finger or some kind of responsibility in mining, and everyone knows the more people in the room, it's a drag on efficiency, speed, and competitiveness, especially when we're competing overseas. So what do you think can be done? The Bureau of Mines is long gone, but to improve our speed and competitiveness and coordination and collaboration within the federal government to come to kind of a more focused approach.
This is a really important point, and it's one of the reasons why I'm glad the Trump administration has adopted this Energy Dominance Council, chaired by Secretary of the Interior Doug Burgum, to serve as kind of a clearinghouse. It's also similar to, I think, the reasons why the office in the White House, CEQ, was created many decades ago to serve as sort of a clearinghouse for that sort of thing. Within any administration, they might do it slightly differently, depending on what laws may or may not have changed in the meantime. But this is really important, because otherwise the left hand may not know what the right hand is doing, even if they're working on the same team. They might undermine each other. It's one of the many reasons why these things have all combined in such a way as to create these really long delays. There was a study performed last year by S&P Global that found the average time in the U.S. to go from concept to full-on production on mining activities in this area, 29 years.
29 years, ouch.
Second to last in the whole world, the only country that even that fared worse than that was Zambia, 34 years. Now, if you think about what that does to investment in one's ability to produce, it's absolutely devastating. It's like saying to a young married couple, you want to get married? Great. Wait 29 years first on a waiting list while you're in limbo.
Yeah.
Imagine what that would do to our already declining birth rate. Yeah. So too here, if you have to wait for 29 years from concept to production, you're going to have a lot less production. And even where production, in fact, occurs, you're going to lose roughly 1/3 of the value of the whole project just through delays, given just the sheer time value function of money.
Exactly.
So if you punish things, if you discourage things, you will get less of those things. And if you remove those impediments and streamline it, you can get more of it. More is what we want.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to end on. So, Senator Lee, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to see you. Take care. So we just have a 1-minute pause whilst we trade microphones for Brandon Craig, who's the president of BHP Americas. I think one point, editorial comment is, 29 years from concept to production is crazy. That is actually longer than the life of a lot of private equity funds. So there's a real dislocation between the time frame. But I don't think, the Golden Gate Bridge was built in 4 years. The Germans circumvented all their permitting laws to rapidly build LNG plants. And they built LNG plants in 9 months for importing of LNG that usually take them 6 years. And there was no environmental degradation as a result. So I think we can do things fast and do them well. Brandon, good to see you again. How are you? I'm good, mate. Yourself?
Very good, thank you. Good
And
morning,
not to be confused, New Zealand accent, South African accent, okay? So just before there's any people scratching their heads.
Excellent.
Brandon, good to see you again, mate.
Thank you.
So we're going to jump right into your question. Let me get my cheat sheet out for you. So first we're going to talk about the copper famine, as I call it. A lot of people don't talk about copper because we're wrapped up in this rare earth element discussion, which is important for the defence. But with copper, we're talking about this production deficit of close to 10 million tonnes, or 30-40% of production by 2035. And just to help everybody, that's the equivalent every year of 22 Californian or United Kingdom grids that don't happen from a power perspective. And to date, I think there's a statistic that says 20% of current production's offline as well, for a variety of methods. So as we think about that, and this gap starts in 2035, if not earlier, how do we respond to that? How do we make, and then 29 years to develop something if we got it today? How do we overcome this deficit? What are the things that the industry is doing and needs to do, and what role can the government have, I guess, in that as well?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. And just for people's benefit, BHP is the world's largest mining company by market cap. We're the world's largest copper producer, and our copper head office is run out of Santiago in Chile, where we have most of our copper assets. To the question, it's an important one, because just listening to Senator Lee before this, I think a lot of us cite that the 29-year discover to develop number. And for those of us who are in the industry, what is very, very clear is the number of mines that have to be developed to meet global production between now and 2035 is about 10 million tonnes. And the way we try and contextualize that is the world's largest mine is the mine we operate, Escondida in Chile. That mine produces just over 1 million tonnes a year. We would have to build the equivalent of 10 of those mines over the course of the next 10 years. And you do the maths based on how long it takes to do the permitting and development of a large-scale greenfield. It sort of puts the challenge into perspective, how difficult it is actually going to be to do that undertaking. And then when you look at copper itself, it's not the easiest mineral to find anymore. It's more scarce than a lot of other materials. So a lot of challenges in industry, like you're here with rare earths today, is very much we know where they are, but we're trying to solve processing complexities and other things. With copper, we have to fundamentally discover and develop. And there's a couple of constraints to that. So first, copper mines are getting deeper or higher in the Andes. Getting infrastructure to these mines is incredibly challenging. The capital cost for the scale of mines we need to bring on board is very, very high. So copper's in a very unique situation where we have to accelerate permitting, we have to get infrastructure support, we have to invest in technology to do a better job of discovering the future copper resources we need, and we need to be able to accelerate the development pathways we need to be able to bring that copper to market. I think it's going to be an immensely challenging task for the world to meet that requirement, and it's going to have to take a very concerted effort for policymakers, regulators, for those who set industrial policy in terms of investments in infrastructure, and of course mining houses around the world to do the investments and accelerate those investments to actually bring that mineral to market, or we are going to end up in a structural deficit of some size.
Yeah, which is just going to slow down the expansion of energy, etc. And just so everyone knows, the IEA, actually S&P Global calls copper the metal of electricity. It's the only metal that spans all forms of energy production and other industrial uses, so it's pretty critical to everything that we do. So a deficit is going to be fairly devastating.
Yes.
So just kind of pivot into, it's a long menu list of the things. One of those is, the energy, water, and waste intensity of copper production is ever increasing. The costs are getting greater, as you mentioned. There just seems to be a grand innovation challenge in there somewhere around how do we do mining differently? And maybe this is not something the mining industry should be doing alone. Other sectors, the government. What role do you see in terms of accelerating innovation for the US government, other sectors that rely on copper for their finished products?
Listen, I think it's really, really important. So when you look at a traditional copper flow sheet, it actually is pyrometallurgical smelting of sulfide-based resources. That's energy intensive, it's water intensive. So you have to put a lot of infrastructure in place to support mines of that scale of development. But innovation can fundamentally change the game to some extent. And if you look at the last 20 years, there's been a lot of investment into leaching technologies and different flow sheets, because when you think of very large projects like Escondida, to do that via leaching is very difficult because of the pure scale. For the benefits of those who are not familiar with leaching, you effectively have to mine the ore, build a very large waste pile, and then irrigate it with acid, recover the solution, and then do a refining process on the back of that. But for smaller scale projects, that's absolutely viable. But it doesn't work effectively on every single type of copper ore. So I think innovation and investment in technology that would allow you to access lower grade resources to be able to do that for smaller deposits, so that you can get smaller capital deployed more rapidly with less infrastructure, I think is huge potential for actually supporting bringing a lot more copper into market. So I think the future will be a far greater mix of technology than what is the case today. But a lot of that is obviously still under development as we're trying to solve some of those technical issues.
I think the interesting one you mentioned there is this kind of how we unlock these uneconomic, technically not feasible deposits today. And I know Richard Atchison talked about it in The Economist a few years ago, and we talk about it a lot. So it's kind of the unconventional moment, which is what happened with unconventional oil and gas. It had, not saying the technology is the same, but it unlocked a resource that nobody thought we could get to. It's pretty vital.
Especially when it's difficult to put in large-scale infrastructure. Like if you had the choice between building a smelter in Arizona, for example, or putting in place a leaching flow sheet, if you could get the leaching to work at the required levels of recovery, that would be a far more economic investment for people to make.
Absolutely. One point just for people I know, so one of the things that's challenging copper is what they call declining grade. So we're down to 0.5 of 1% of rock is copper, and also depth. I think it's worth just explaining, without going into too much technical detail, but what's the significance of that, of kind of grade and depth that's really challenging the industry?
Well, it's natural for grade to, when you look at the geological action that produces a copper deposit, you get, typically, it's not always the case, but you get the best grade at the surface, and the grade reduces as you go to depth. Now, most of the large surface discoveries have been found. There are some still out there, but the really large ones have mostly been found. So mines are getting deeper, and when you get deeper, the technical complexity goes up significantly in terms of how you mine and how you operate those facilities. And I think what you've seen with Grasberg recently, I'm not sure if people follow to that level of detail.
It's terrible.
But when you look at some of the major events that have happened, even in the past year, the risk of significant supply disruption becomes very real when you have to go underground. So it gets more complex, it gets more expensive, it becomes higher cost. And the only way you can do that at scale is you'll ultimately have to drive copper pricing higher to be able to incentivize the level of investment you need for that particular mining method. And you know, there's a couple of probably really economic undeveloped copper still in DRC, Zambia, and so on. But when you look at the bulk of copper, it's porphyry in the Andean belt from Canada all the way through to South America. And as those facilities start to go underground, the complexity and scale and capital is going to be much higher.
Yeah, so I think we need to, particularly downstream companies, really need to understand the supply risks of, even as supply comes on, the disruption gets higher as
Yeah,
gets
absolutely.
higher as well.
Absolutely.
Let's switch gears and Indigenous communities. So,
Yes.
and my non-profit does a lot of work with Indigenous communities, and I know they have a concern that this kind of mad rush to critical mineral supply is going to sideline their drive to capture more of the value and less of the negative of mining. And BHP is a leader with Indigenous communities in Australia. You guys are doing great work in Chile, and I think people, their concurrence of projects, whether it's legal or not legal, is not irrelevant. It's critical to a project to have them buy into a project. How does BHP think about this in terms of the projects you have active and looking at?
Sure.
It's a really important area that I think is glossed over a lot.
Sure. So we do think it's very, very important because important stakeholders, First Nations, as well as people who are going to live and work near our mines, you cannot operate a modern mine without the support of the communities and the First Nations people that surround that mine. I mean, that's a social expectation from the public that we have to meet. And at the same time, we look at it through the lens of creating mutually beneficial outcomes.
Yep.
So what that looks like is we invest in capacity building. So we think creating economic empowerment and jobs and benefits produces a win-win situation. And at the same time, when you engage cooperatively with First Nations groups, it actually has a positive effect in terms of accelerating permits and creating a very strong stakeholder or ally in your project. Where if you're thoughtful about that and you do it with genuine intent, you actually end up in a situation where you can actually move faster, not slower. I think where companies tend to get into trouble is they sort of move first without thinking about that, without having a clear plan or a set of principles for why it's important and how we do it. And when you try and fix it later, that becomes problematic. So if you think it through very clearly up front, you start off from the premise of creating genuine social value for the stakeholders that surround the mine. More often than not, you can move faster and for better overall value.
Can we just unpack, my non-profit created a term, the triangle of trust, which is this kind of trust exercise. First, you've got to build and then nurture the trust between companies, the Indigenous communities, and the government. Can you just kind of unpack that? Because I think people don't think about it as a kind of a three-way thing in terms of what you would need to do as a company to keep that going.
So I'm not sure whether I'd call it
a triangle
of trust.
We call it a triangle of trust, but yeah.
But I think the way we think about it is, it's not sufficient to just look at what the law says and do that. Because the set of stakeholders that impact on investments is far more complicated and far more important that we sort of think through the full set of stakeholders and their influence and benefit from projects. So government normally sets out regulations. They set out how land title will work. They set out how projects should be developed, the minimum level of consultation. But that doesn't necessarily set up a project to be able to move fast or to create the right level of benefits. So we tend to have a very clear set of principles of how we ultimately do engagement with First Nations and communities. And on the back of that, I think we've had great success. And we treat government regulation really as the minimum expectation for how we think about that.
I think that's a key point, Brandon, is going beyond what regulations, because regulations are different around the world, but actually setting a standard that's above any government regulation. And it sounds like to me, maybe you want to kind of talk a bit more to this, is I think BHP's creating a discussion that's creating more of an opportunity approach versus risk mitigation, because I think a lot of companies use First Nation, let's consult with them to mitigate risk, versus it sounds like you are thinking of this more as an opportunity for the business.
We think it's bad business to have communities around the areas where we operate that are either impoverished, jobless, or have a set of issues. I mean, that, these investments that we make in mining, they can be 50, 70, 80 years. We have a unique advantage over government in that where we mine tends to be more in First Nations or Indigenous areas, more so than any other business group that is out there. So in a way, we have a natural connection with being the industry sector in a country that has the greatest opportunity to be able to invest in the economic empowerment of people who are living in those particular areas. And if mining didn't do it, it's very hard to try and define who would. So I think that's the lens we see this through. So it's very important for us that we understand, who is going to be, living around the areas that we invest in. in recognition that we're going to be there potentially for up to a century. We see it as, in a way, almost our natural role to be the key industry segment that tries to drive that level of economic empowerment across those particular areas. And it's not replacing the responsibility of government.
Sure.
But I think when you look at what government tends to do in terms of these regions, plus what we can complement, that together with all of our industry peers who also do a very good job of this, can actually be quite transformative for people living in these regions. And we can point to many, many case studies where these particular groups have gone on to create extremely successful businesses that are very competitive in their own right, offer incredibly good services back to the mine. So it started with the idea and concept, went through capacity building and development. The company supports that. The end result is groups that are fully economically empowered, offering very good services very competitively. And some of them have grown into state-based players over time. So often these groups just need the right opportunity and the right support to be able to make that change.
This is pretty exciting, really, when you think about it. It's, I don't know, I don't think this is an area that's extremely well understood by people outside the mining industry in terms of, the significance of First Nations and the role the industry is playing in lifting them up from a prosperity perspective. How do you think we should go about, actually, I think? Is there an education that's required here, do you think? Or?
Listen, I think it's a very difficult area. And I find sort of in the public at large, it's not something that governments necessarily talk to, because I think a lot of these groups will claim that the situation is a product of government failure or policy failure, economic failure. There's a range of reasons that I think the public debate around the role of business, the role of First Nations, how all of that comes together. It's not a discussion that I think probably doesn't happen enough. But I think if you separate yourself from that public discussion and you just look through the lens of doing what the right thing is, we tend to find our way through.
Key phrase, do the right thing. Closing point, I don't know how our clock's going, but it's hard to not see a copper deficit emerging. I think I was in London last couple of weeks, and it was FT Mining, LME Week, ICMM, and everybody was talking about a copper deficit. I mean, I was on a panel with the CEO of Aurora Minerals, a Brazilian copper mine. He just goes, I don't know where all the copper's coming from. So there's this universal thing from the mining industry, is no idea where all this copper's coming from by 2035. What should people be doing? I mean, it's real, so how should we be preparing for this potential deficit? And I think Robert Friedland said we're in the foothills of a significant copper deficit. So what should we be thinking about? What advice would you give?
Well, I think major structural deficits ultimately end up damaging industries.
Yes.
So that's one way to think about it. So if the industry lets a deficit build that's too big, you actually induce substitution and a range of other risks, or you constrain economic growth, or you produce a range of unintended impacts. So it's really important that I think the industry understands the scale of the potential deficit that could arise, and then take the steps necessary to actually accelerate investments into the right deposit. Now, there's a lot of things, and I mentioned a couple of things at the start of this, what is actually required to make this happen. And that sort of 29 years, that's really fascinating. But the interesting thing is that there's no shortage of copper in the world, but there's a shortage of high quality copper.
Yes.
So a couple of things can happen to respond. One, people know where lower grade copper is. If the price responds appropriately, there will be investment into that. There has been a lot of technology unlocks in recent decades. But I think ultimately, when you look at the pace of investment today in the projects, yes, if you look at everything through today's lens, you're going to go, this is going to be really, really challenging. But what normally happens in markets is prices are the signal for investment.
Sure.
And at some point, those resources that are known but are not being developed will be developed at some point when the price responds appropriately to those signals. Are we quite there yet? No. So the prices today are still supportive of the better quality resources being developed, but it hasn't moved to the point where lower quality resources are being developed. So when the world reaches a point that the copper has to come, and it has to come very, very quickly, you'll see a response, and you'll see industry respond into the back of that. And the best case study is probably what happened in the iron ore industry from sort of 2005 to 2015, where the price went up significantly from $20 a ton to sort of 80, 100. And the investment flooded into the sector, and the sector was able to respond appropriately. So in the end, there'll be a range of forces. You've got to find it. We need better technology to find the future resources. Ultimately, we'll need a price response to support the lower grade resources. We'll have to solve permitting, and we'll have to get governments to support us with that, together with some strategic infrastructure investments. And if you get that combination to come together, then the world can respond.
That's
to,
kind of
to
it.
the
So you
deficit.
just identified signals to be watching for everyone. So, Brandon, thanks very much. I think we just nailed it with 20 minutes. So any last comments or takeaways for everyone? I think you just gave it to them, but any last comments?
No, just thank you for having me.
Yes, we could really appreciate it, and good luck with everything. And we'll see you at the embassy a bit later as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Brandon.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Clicker.
We're just going to take a few minutes break, and then we'll be back with our illustrious scholars. All right. So we'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you. All right, we're going to get started again. Thank you. I'm just going to welcome to the stage Peter Bryant and Satish Rao, the authors of our critique of the IEA's 2025 Critical Minerals Outlook.
Awesome. Just move the slides. Oop. Great. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed the fireside chats. So we're just going to unpack a little bit more, kind of summarize the report that we did in terms of the IEA's critical minerals analysis. So I think what we're saying is that the IEA, whilst they identified some things, they really did not go deep enough or show the significance of some of the things that we're talking about today. So the first one, obviously, is really identifying and analyzing the market-shaping activities of China across a broad range of minerals. And it's really and it was very policy neutral, so it's really important to kind of unpack those market-shaping activities. The second area is really, and we talked about with Brandon, is the social license to operate, which is not a term I particularly like, but really is how First Nation communities around the world, and 80% of all minerals reside on or are next to in First Nation communities. And this is a really important topic and shouldn't be thought about as a nuisance factor that we kind of mitigate. It's really, really important, and it's a key determinant of whether a project can go ahead or not. The third area is this whole thing, again, that Brandon talked about, this ore grade decline and depth increase. In other words, good copper is a huge, significant innovation challenge, and we'll unpack that a little bit more. And just to be a blind faith in innovation and technology meeting the challenge in the time frame that we needed to is really kind of linear thinking in my book as well. And then finally, what does it mean to have these mineral deficits? I think we really need to understand from a scenario base, and in scenario language, I think these deficits are real. They're probably going to happen, they probably will happen, not possible. So what are the implications? What has to be sidelined? What amount of electricity can't be generated in the time frame we need? How many AI data centers does that mean don't happen? How many EVs don't get produced? So we really need to understand, because it affects investment strategies, etc. So let's kind of unpack some of this a little bit more. We did talk about with Brandon this copper deficit. This is huge. Whether it's IEA, S&P, everybody talks about, if you think about it, it takes 29 years to develop and build a mine. and maybe in good jurisdictions 15 years, even if I'm standing on a resource today, it's not going to come into production well past 2035. If you take all the projects we know about and all the production currently linearly, we have a 10 million tonne gap based on demand projections. This is huge, and I think we need to definitely understand what are the implications behind that. We'll kind of unpack that, but this is a massive deficit. As we talked about, it's equivalent of 22 Californian grids every year being short, and millions of EVs, etc. The supply shocks are huge. So again, the projections are based on the 24 million tonne production just being linear. Today, there are estimates that 20% of copper production today is offline. 20% of the 24 million tonnes is not happening, and there's a variety of issues for that. So the second biggest copper mine in the world is Grasberg in Papua New Guinea. It had a landslide underground, 800,000 tonnes landslide, 7 workers killed. And Freeport, who owns the mine, said it won't come back online at best till 2027. It's the second largest copper mine in the world. And that requires a deep analysis. So as we're stressing assets, as they become technically more difficult, it's potential that 20% of supply is just constantly offline for the next 10, 15 years as we stretch the technical capabilities of mining. And this is something, again, that's not even factored in. So it just adds risk and builds up this deficit as a reality that we need to address quite significantly. Not to hammer this indigenous, I call it the indigenous reframe. Indigenous communities basically say, in the history of mining, all they've ever seen is no benefit and nothing but negative outcomes. And I've been in enough discussions where it's very rare to show me a mining project in the history of the industry where a community is better off after mining has finished than it was when mining arrived. And the industry is doing great things to move that forward, but the gap continues to grow as Indigenous people seek more and more of the value of the resource they're on. And I think one of the things they say, we had the Grand Chief of the Cree Nation, Matthew Kuhn, come on our non-profit board, and he used to say, we find the term consultation insulting. We actually want participation as owners. So I think it's just really understanding what Indigenous people want. And some of these quotes are pretty shocking. And as Brandon said, we need Indigenous communities to support and have their prosperity grow as part of a mining project. And I think it's an area that non-Indigenous people really struggle with, and it's something that we really need to get our heads around, because we need to operate beyond legal requirements, because we see enough of Indigenous communities disrupting development of mines and the operations of mines in a way that's really negative for the industry. We can't understate China. I know there was a kind of a term in the IEA report that used some of China's market responses, flooding market, as flexible supply response. It's not exactly how I would frame it. They have we spent a lot of time on this, they have a very sophisticated market shaping playbook using different techniques around the globe to apply a choke point to each mineral in a different way. And if you think about it, we talked about rare earth. The rare earth one is I control all extraction and all processing. So I'll decide if I give it to you or not. So we've got no choice. With lithium, they do most of the processing. So Australia sends most of its lithium, which is the world's biggest producer, to China for processing. So they can manipulate the supply and the price by flooding the market accordingly. But then that's a different response we need to do. And nickel, we talked about, they control the Indonesian nickel industry through ownership. So they have a very sophisticated playbook, which all depends on using that leverage to collapse pricing or restrict supply or both. And it's very complicated. And when we're operating in a capitalist market-orientated economy, it's really, really hard to have kind of the responses that we need competitively to respond to that. So we shouldn't understate this in terms of the impact. And this is not actually factored into these minerals deficits or what I call the minerals famine that's happening. So again, something we need to more deeply understand. And that's why I think it's dangerous to say China has X% of critical minerals, because their control point is different for each mineral. So what I might do is hand over to my colleague Satish to talk about some of the technical supply challenges that we have discussed already.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it. And thanks to the NCEA for the opportunity to contribute as well. So I'll talk about the technical supply challenges, which are far tougher than what most policy models assume. We're dealing with physical limits, not investment cycles. As over the last few decades, ore grades have declined, that means we have to move more rock. So that means more diesel in moving those rocks, more emissions, significantly more emissions. And that also means then that you're crushing, grinding more ore, and using a lot more water to just maintain production levels. So it's a constantly moving and challenging paradigm that mining companies have to deal with. As ore grades continue to decline, operations often then have to pivot from being open cut or the surface to then start going underground. And the Grasberg incident that Peter mentioned is an example of what can happen in an underground mine that produces a lot of wet material, as they often end up going to waste. That wet material overflowed into different mine levels, including service levels where staff were working. And those represent some of the challenges. The ore is also getting dirtier. They have deleterious materials. All the cleaner stuff at the surface is getting depleted. So as you go deeper, you're also dealing with changing ore grades and ore types. So now you have to deal with bismuth, arsenic, all of the other stuff that smelters can remove, but for a mining company, they will impose fines on. It's not just the dirty stuff. There's also some good byproducts that are techno-economically very challenging to extract. So yes, it would be great for a copper or nickel mine to start getting molybdenum, or that's important, or you could have other rare earths in some of those. But to add on to already very complex processing flow sheet just increases the complexity by far. So those byproducts end up going to waste and not really utilized. So what we're looking at is really the physics of depletion are currently outpacing the promise of inflation, a promise of innovation, and no one's modeling that risk. So that's one of the big takeaways when you look at it from a pure technical perspective. It's not just about mining, so I've talked about mining and minerals. It's also about the understanding the implications. Can we build the future systems that we are forecasting, right? So the implications of those technical realities go far beyond mining. They ripple through the entire energy and technology systems. The supply shocks are becoming more systemic. Grasberg incident, there was a closure of Cobre Panama, one of the large copper mines in Panama. Those are examples where non-market risks have global impact. Each disruption spikes input costs higher for electric vehicles, grids, renewables, delaying deployment and straining budgets. The energy expansion and technology competitiveness is at risk. We talked about permitting and policy uncertainty, and lack of capital inflows gets impacted as you look at policy uncertainty over the long duration of the cycles for permitting. So the bottom line, it comes down to whether we can build the future systems that we are forecasting, and what are the tools and scenarios that we would need to incorporate in order to understand the implications to these downstream sectors. I'll turn it back to Peter, and we'll join in here.
Great, thanks, Satish. Yeah. I think actually there was a key statistic on Satish's slide, just to kind of put this into reality for you. Think about 16 times more energy to produce a pound of copper recently than it was 25 years ago. And by the way, that's exponentially increasing. And again, think about this tonnage, because I think what people confuse is rare earth elements are extremely low volume but high value because of defense need. But these are extreme low volume compared to these copper, nickel, lithium, cobalt, all these other industrial metals that we need. And I think, so think about, if I have to produce an extra 10 million tons and the grade is 0.5%, you multiply 10 million tons by, 200. That's how much rock I'm moving, sometimes 10, 20 miles to get to a smelter or crushing plant. I mean, this is enormous energy usage of actually moving essentially non-valuable materials around. So I think it's a big number, but it's something we need to get our head around, because it's not something we can do, because the key is low-cost production. So the last thing we want to talk about is what is our recommendation in terms of responses. So I'll put my glasses on, unfortunately. So first is an integrated minerals policy model. We need a competitive position to be able to de-risk our supply chain and win against adversaries in terms of the control of the supply chains. And we can only do that with a policy model that comes up in terms of it's integrated across all the agencies, leverages all the different abilities of the United States and our allies in terms of helping. The key is here, countries want to grow their prosperity based on the mineral endowment they have that God gave them. So we need to help enable that, and I think we have a lot of, whether it's entrepreneurship, infrastructure, but it's not just about the mineral. And the tension is these countries want to maintain more of the downstream value of their resource in their country to grow the prosperity, because they're at a different part of their development cycle. And that needs what I think is quite an integrated but also sophisticated policy towards those countries that we are yet to do. And China is really the only game in town right now for a lot of those countries, so we need to be much smarter at that. And again, secondly is kind of an interagency framework that agencies can use to think about whether it's in the United States, what are the different types of minerals, what are the policy responses, what are the types of mining companies. The Key Mineral Forum put out the Minerals Resilience Framework, which talks about what are the different responses. So for example, what we're doing with rare earth elements will absolutely not work in all the minerals we're talking about. Won't work in copper, won't work in lithium, won't work in nickel, because these are extremely low volume, high value. So you have different policy response to what you may do for copper or nickel. And I think we need to kind of have a framework where different administrations, the departments, etc., can think about it in a much more sophisticated way to have the right policy response and work with allies and other countries that have the resources in a positive way. Coordinating mechanism, this is tough. 17 agencies, my goodness. I mean, anybody working in companies, imagine having 17 departments responsible for one thing. And we haven't quite, we've got David Copley's moved to the National Security Council. I'm not sure just a single czar, that's a step. We're not going to be able to recreate the Bureau of Mines, so we need a single coordinating something in the United States government to bring all these agencies together and have a coordinated plan and strategy towards minerals development domestically and internationally. And finally, innovation. I mean, you heard Brandon talk about, and this is this dislocation. So we need a price signal to trigger increased innovation to unlock resources that are unlockable at the moment. The problem is markets are short-term. So we're talking about things that are 10 years away. Markets are not pricing in 10-year supply deficits. I mean, they're reacting at, copper $11,000 a ton today. That's a response to Grasberg. They're not pricing in a deficit that's 5, 10, 15 years away. So I'm not sure there is a systemic price signal that's just going to be sustained for long enough to create increased investment and innovation. So I think that's where a government response in partnership with not only mining but other sectors. We often talk about downstream industry like auto companies, etc., sleepwalking into this minerals deficit. And I always cheekily say it's as if McDonald's really actually didn't understand where all the buns and meat patties were coming from in a couple of years. And were shocked like, why is there a supply shortage and why has prices tripled? And that would be a nonsense to them. But I think that's what's happening with downstream industries. They aren't really paying attention to the extreme upstream supply that they are ultimately dependent upon. So I think those are the kind of areas and actions that we would recommend for the US government to employ. And again, the thing I would encourage is this is about dialogue and conversation, deepened understanding and coming up with the right responses in an extremely competitive world. So what I'd like to do is just hit pause there and actually go into a Q&A session. So we're probably a few minutes ahead of time actually, which is not bad, so I always like that. So I'll sit down and open it up to questions. This gentleman first, and then young lady there. Yes, sir. Do we need microphones? I don't think so. Yes, recycling.
And I'm assuming that's because it doesn't really amount to all that much, but just curious about that. And the second question is, when you talk about increased demand, how much of that demand is from this so-called energy transition that we're supposed to be
Sure.
doing? How much of it is from artificial intelligence and defense industry, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I'll answer your second question first, then I'll hand to Satish to answer recycling. So I think the increased demand, I mean, it's broad because a lot of it's around energy expansion, but it's almost energy type agnostic too. So certainly copper is needed, and a lot of metals are needed in massive increments more if you're doing wind and solar. I mean, they use a ton more minerals than fossil fuel-based energy. But an example would be transformers, which you need for any type of electricity generation. Right now, there's a 4-year wait for a transformer. 60% of the cost of a transformer is copper. Okay, so it's totally dependent on copper. So think about if suddenly there's a worldwide shortage of transformers, that just slows down electricity, which slows down AI data centers, and it just ripples through the economy. So, so a lot of it is around electricity, but you know, copper and a lot of the minerals are used in all sorts of other activities, industrial activities. So, but electricity expansion, not only in the US, think about it, there's 1 billion people in the world without electricity as they build it out. So the stress on minerals is going to be real as we expand electricity generation. So I always say we're in the age of expansion, not transition anymore. So transition is really not a great term anymore. So Satish, maybe on recycling.
Indeed, on recycling. So the good news is that a lot of these metals, copper is infinitely recyclable. The challenge is getting to all of the copper where it is, or for other minerals, it's even harder because they're used in very minute quantities in many different applications. So building that reverse supply chain and being able to get that out is a big, big challenge. So iron ore, steel, as iron ore gets converted to steel, steel has one of the highest recycling rates. Copper is probably relatively high, speaking to other critical minerals, but it's still low. So those are absolutely things that have to be considered, should be on the table. There are companies working on it. There's new technologies that are being developed to improve recycling. But you're always, a recycler is always going to be competing against new metal coming in. So the economics matter as well for the reverse supply chain and the reverse logistics to get the materials and then to refine it and then produce new material out. So it's always going to be a little bit of an economic trade-off competing against the new supply coming on. But it's absolutely given that has to be considered, and there's many different, so trading companies are looking at recycling as well. A lot of the big majors are looking at the full life cycle. One last point on that, I think designing the products so that the materials can be recycled is going to be important. So that's again coming slowly coming into the mainstream. But it's not going to be sufficient. It's just from a pure recycling perspective is not going to be sufficient. Yeah. Especially if you look at it, we believe in the age of energy expansion, but if you take a look at transition for just a second, if you were to imagine the hydrocarbon-based economy transitioning to a material-based economy in 20, 30 years, you're replacing 80% of energy generation through hydrocarbons. You're going to need a significant amount of new materials, whether it's copper, lithium, all of these critical materials in 30 years. And that's the risk that's not been sufficiently modeled or understood well. No amount of existing recycling can get you there. Is it one of the more important levers? Absolutely.
Yeah, and I just one point on that too is I always look to analogs to kind of use. The world's been focused on recycled plastic for decades, probably the last 10 years. And the plastic manufacturers want to do it. No one has been able to get recycled plastic down at a lower cost than new plastic. And nobody wants to pay more for something. I mean, it's just evident. And no matter who they are, auto manufacturers, they want the cheapest input they can. And yes, we'd like recycled. Yes, we'd like things developed or mined to the highest environmental standards, but we're not paying a premium for it. And that's just the way it is. And so that's one of the economics is a huge challenge. So, yeah. So question over here? Yeah.
Thank you. On the previous slide, you're talking about the risks and implications. And under implications, you mentioned unfavorable public policy. Could you expand on what that looks like?
Sure.
I guess second to last slide.
Yeah, I think it's with the last slide, the recommendation. Yeah, so.
I think it was the one before.
Oh, your one?
Yeah, so part of it is what you heard both Senator Lee talk and Peter talk about, which is permitting is a big issue. So public policy can impacts permitting. It can also impact economic incentives, and it can impact what's capital flows. So public policy can serve as a leverage point across multiple aspects in unlocking supply. So until and unless all of those levers are understood and addressed, things are going to be challenging. And it's one of the reasons why capital flows aren't really happening because they're looking at 20, 30, multiple decades of payback, and there's a little bit of a gap between when their investors expect returns back and when actually returns can be generated. So I think policy is a tool that can be applied, but it has to be selectively applied based on the different mineral characteristics of what it is that the choke points and regulations that you're trying to address.
Yeah.
Peter, you
Also,
wanna
there's
build on
another
that?
dimension for the downstream industries too, like power generators. So I've spoken to a lot of utilities. We do work with Edison Electricity Institute. Many utilities are on the hook, based on public policy of their state governments, to roll out renewable energy, blah, blah, blah. And if they know there is high risk to that, meeting that public policy regulation because of supply chain issues, they need to then rethink how they are engaging with the government at a public policy level and warn them that, being on the hook for these things is actually maybe high at risk. So there's a dual strategy, what I do with my business and how do I work with the government to, understand public policy in a better way. And it may change how they think about their lobbying efforts as well. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Up over here. Yep.
Thank you. Dan Coynier, so with aerospace, so at Airbus, so belonging to downstream industries,
Yes.
which hopefully are not sleepwalking anymore. So connecting to the point that Senator Lee made about the two-step process and the international cooperation and even reliance, how do you connect, because you broach on it, the recommendation that you set for Congress and the administration with this reliance and cooperation with international partners? So which of the four, or are all the four intertwined with international partnerships, so that, for instance, the critical mineral policy is a global one?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, great question, and I think we probably both have responses. Let me start with that. I think it's we could have been, it's implicit that none of this can happen without close collaboration with other countries, and it's beyond allies. I mean, look at take copper, or even lithium. I mean, copper's in Peru, Chile, Australia, Argentina has a big deposit, Zambia. A couple of those countries are allies, and others are countries that are kind of friendly, but, neutral. So it's laced throughout this. We can't do this. I believe it's an absolute fantasy to believe that we can bring back production and refining 100% to the United States. It's just not going to happen. So we need to think about, not only in the interim, but the long term, how do we collaborate with those countries in a way that they grow their prosperity? Simultaneously, we're de-risking the supply chain. It's a huge challenge, but it's one that we've got to meet and face pretty damn quickly. Because every day that we sit here thinking about it, somebody else is playing. As one person told me at a dinner, they're playing three-dimensional chess, and we are not sure what game we want to play. So international collaboration, agreement, whatever we want to call it, but it has to be done in a way that respects other countries' needs and our needs as well. So it's a balancing act that requires, and I think the US is up for it, and our allies as well, but we need to get going on that. So it's maybe we should be more explicit about it, so yeah.
And I'll add, in many cases, the resources are where they are, where Mother Earth placed them. However, what the U.S. has is our technological capabilities and advancements, and that's where I think there's a huge advantage, whether it's our national labs under the DOE or research and commercialization efforts, venture capital that targets emerging new promising technologies. So I think that's what needs to be unlocked and provided to the resources where they are, so that those can be extracted, developed in safe and environmentally sustainable manners. So that's another opportunity, I think, is to put our technological might into the right places in wherever those resources might need to be mined, including in the U.S., of course, but globally.
Yeah, and the last point too is not only collaboration with countries, but I think the mining industry is critical, but it's a pretty small industry, relatively, So I think the scale of the challenge requires a much more level of collaboration between different sectors that are mineral dependent along with mining. So kind of aerospace, for example, mining and government working together to solve some of these big challenges, and maybe going to these countries as well in ways that are much more productive for them as well. So, yep, over this way.
Hi, I'm Tim Pucco with Eurasia Group. Appreciated your discussion of how much or how often important minerals get thrown away in waste rock. And I wanted to revisit that because I think some of your conclusions there are a little bit, at least contrary to the story industry tells. I feel like, and I'm speaking very anecdotally here, so feel free to set me straight on any of this. But I think you talk to enough companies and you get the sense that, you know, innovation is still strong. There is a lot of opportunity to get these minerals out of tailings pits with new technology. Maybe it'd be nice to have some tax credits or government support. And so I just kind of wanted to hear a little bit more about what led you all to the conclusions that innovation is low right now and the possibility for improvement there is limited.
Yeah. So I'll answer at a meta level and then Satish could jump in. So I kind of think, I mean, we've written about this a lot. I mean, the industry persistently is underinvested in innovation. It's around 0.5% to 1% of revenue in innovation persistently over time. Oil and gas 4 or 5%, manufacturing 2.5%. Multiple studies on that. And it's kind of the pressure on the industries growing up has, you know, really pushed with these demand increases. And plus, their adoption rates for new technology for a whole bunch of technical reasons is very slow. So I kind of lump innovation into 3 buckets, and Satish can jump into that. One is, how do I radically improve cost, energy efficiency, et cetera, of current waste to mine? How do I turn waste to value? There's a bunch of reasons we're just really scratching on the surface of that. And then as Brandon said, how do we come up with new ways of mining to unlock technically unfeasible resources? But the waste to value is just in its very early days, absolutely. So Satish, you want to kind of unpack that one?
Yeah, so is the industry doing something in innovation that addresses trying to get those value products? Yes, there's a lot of work going on in that space. But they're very early technologies. They need a lot of support in order to scale up and succeed at the scale that the industry needs them. And that needs a very nurturing environment from both the corporate mining companies that have access to these. So the tailings are sitting, so there may be legacy tailings that have been closed or in operations. The scale of tailings in some of the metals like copper is enormous. Yeah. And so being able to go back and remine those tailings, those wastes to get the rare earths out, it's going to be an enormous undertaking. Oftentimes for those legacy tailings, we have no idea. So they may have been tailings that were generated when the mine was processing 1% or 1.5% copper. So anything below that might have ended up. So there may be situations where the tailings have a higher grade of copper than what's being mined, but we have no idea if they're legacy tailings and closed. So in order to go back through tailings, it's going to need an enormous push to really characterize. So you're going to have to rethink the same mining value chain from exploration, characterization to mining and processing. You have to now think of that as with the input feedstock being tailings. So you have to first characterize and understand where everything is, what's of value, what's going to be economic, and then what's the right mix of technologies that we need to remine it. And these tailings can change over time because of weather and because of events, and you need permitting reform to, again, allow for reprocessing the tailings, because today all they're doing is monitoring the geotechnical stability and safety. So if you want to reprocess it, how is that going to impact geotechnical stability of those mines? Yeah. So there's enormous amounts of policy and regulatory aspects that would need to be developed, and also the underlying technologies to then extract the value out of it. And then is that going to eliminate the problems of tailings? No, you're going to maybe extract, going back to the same 1, 2, 3% of what's in the tailings. You're going to have to then put the remainder back in. So that's the challenge at the high scale. That's what's very difficult to do, especially when it comes to low volume minerals like rare earths, which are in very minute concentrations.
Yeah. No, so I always borrow from Gartner, the hype cycle. So your point, I think there's a lot of hype in the industry. I mean, Freeport's doing some good things on copper and tailings. I know, for example, all the utilities that have big coal ash tailing dams here in the US are kind of pondering, how do I get rare earths, because we know rare earths in there, but is it economic? Is the technology available? And all of this is very early days, as Satish said. So yes, there's some anecdotal stories positive, but we're very much in the early days. And nobody's sure, can we do this economically? Rare earths, again, I'll say is an exception, because with defense-related minerals that are pure for defense, or just pay whatever we need to get our hands on them. So that's, and I think the mistake is that's not for every mineral. We can't do that. It's just the money's not there. So rare earths is an exception and not the rule. So we just need to be careful. So I think we've run out of time for questions. So I'll hand back to Portia to wrap it up and take us home. Thanks, Portia. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you for joining us, and thank you again to our report authors and to our speakers. If you can change the slide, there's a QR code that you can use to download the report if you didn't get a copy already. And if you want to stay and chat, I think the room is free for you to do that as well. So thank you very much. Have a clicker.